This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 886 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog Fantasy. Thanks for tuning in. The running back dead zone is one of the most popular talking points in all of fantasy football. Every analyst will bring it up in their podcasts over the summer. Everyone talks about it. I've done episodes on the topic through the years, plenty. If you're unfamiliar with the dead zone, it's an area of fantasy drafts where two things are happening. The first is that running back value stinks. The dead zone consists of running backs who fail to reach expectation at a really high rate, and they're not giving you a ton of fantasy points. But all the while, and this is the second point to make, all the while, there are pretty good wide receivers that you're missing out on in that dead zone range. So not only are the running backs bad, but there's an opportunity cost component to it as well. And that opportunity cost side to the running back dead zone discussion can't be ignored. Because in today's fantasy football landscape, drafts have become really wide receiver heavy. When wide receivers get drafted earlier and more frequently, running back costs naturally get cheaper. And when running back costs get cheaper, the opportunity cost equation shifts. All of a sudden, the wide receivers we're foregoing in a draft when we select a running back, those wide receivers aren't as good. And that makes it easier to draft the running back, even if that running back is in the dead zone, right? Not so fast. We need to have a deeper conversation about what the dead zone really is. And that's what today's episode is all about. Now, before digging in, I wanted to set another reminder to check out Underdog Fantasy. If you're listening to this episode of the Late Round Podcast, then you would definitely have some interest in the best ball format. That's where you draft a team, and that's it. Your lineup is optimized for you each week based on how many points your team scores. There's no lineup setting, no trades, no waivers. You draft, and you're done. Some might say that it's too early to draft teams for the 2024 season, but I disagree. Now's the time where you can get awesome values on players for the contests that are being drafted all summer long. But there are also contests that fill fast, so everyone's working off of the same information. There were some really cool new contests like the Marathon that dropped just last week. If you've never tried Best Ball out over on Underdog and you want to give it a shot, head to UnderdogFantasy.com or download the Underdog app. When you sign up, use promo code LATEROUND. That's one word. When you do that, you'll not only get a deposit offer, but you'll also get a free late round draft guide. That guide will be emailed to you on July 1st when it launches. And all you have to do is sign up with promo code LATEROUND and make a deposit. That's UnderdogFantasy.com, promo code LATEROUND. So what is the running back dead zone? Where does it occur? What does it all mean? The gist of my dead zone research has revealed the following. In a 12-team league, when you reach the middle of the third round, running back production takes a hit. Meaning the running backs you're taking in the late third round into the fourth round, there's a dramatic difference between those backs and the ones that you're getting in the first and second rounds of your draft. Now, all the while, if you look at how running backs have performed historically in round 6, round 7, their production isn't that far off of running backs drafted in round 4 or 5. So it should make you question those round 4 and 5 running backs. Why draft them when you can get that production later? The opportunity cost side of things come into play here too. Wide receivers have been a little bit more attractive in that round 4, round 5 range through the years. So not only are you drafting inferior running backs, but you're also missing out on a chance at a wide receiver, making that running back selection even worse. With today's wide receiver heavy approach, that opportunity cost equation then shifts. Running backs are now going later. Dead zone backs, instead of going in late round 3 and into round 6, they may not go until round 5 and into round 7 or maybe even round 8, especially on Underdog. Underdog drafts are insanely wide receiver heavy, where top 12 running backs will fall into the 5th round. Best ball drafts lean wide receiver just naturally, but that's unheard of in a regular redraft league, in a home league. And look, it's early June at the time of this recording. The drafts that are happening are for best ball leagues, not managed leagues, for the most part. So I do think our minds are a little bit skewed into thinking that this is the way our home league drafts are going to go. But there's no doubt that leagues will be more wide receiver heavy this year, and potentially next year and the year after that, at least compared to what we've seen over the last decade. And that, to many, means the death of the running back dead zone concept. but I don't agree with that. As I've said now multiple times, there are sort of two things happening with the running back dead zone. Number one, the running backs are just not great producers. Number two, there's a cost involved in drafting them. You're missing out on good players at other positions. Now, for argument purposes, let's just remove number two from our minds right now. Forget the fact that running backs are going later, which lowers opportunity cost. Let's just look at how running backs produce. Because when you look strictly at how running backs produce, you're able to take the concept of the running back dead zone and truly apply it to any league format that you're in. Now let's start by looking at some data. I use fantasydata.com's average draft position data, which dates back to 2014. So we have 10 years of information here. I then took all of the running backs from that ADP, so all running backs since 2014, and I put them in groups. I looked at high-end RB1s, or backs who were drafted as the RB1 to the RB6. Then I looked at low-end RB1s, or guys drafted as the RB7 to the RB12. I did this all the way to low-end RB7s. So we have 14 total groupings. I also only focused on running backs in these groups who played at least 8 games in a season. That's important because I'm going to be looking at points per game numbers, and we don't want small sample sizes warping our results. Now, these groupings are not small. The number of high-end RB1s who played 8 or more games since 2014, for example, that ended up being 48. There were 56 low-end RB1s. There were 54 high-end RB2s. Most of the groups had around 50 to 55 running backs in them. I then took these groups and just wanted to see how well they performed. I know I often look at how players perform versus expectation, but for this research, I just wanted to see how they did in PPR points per game. I looked at the percentage of players in each bucket who scored 14 or more or 16 or more PPR points per game. Now, those are kind of arbitrary numbers, but for everyone's understanding, 14 or more PPR points per game will usually yield a mid-range RB2 season. 16 or more PPR points per game, it's almost always going to get a running back into RB1 range. And that's what we should be caring about most: usability and ceiling. The high-end RB1 group absolutely crushes. They're just really good bets in fantasy football. They've scored 14 or more PPR points per game at a 75% rate. They've gotten to 16 or more PPR points per game at a 58.3% rate. When you look at the low-end RB1 group, or guys who are drafted in that RB7 to RB12 range, those numbers start to fall a little bit, which isn't a surprise because they're not being drafted as high in your fantasy drafts. Their rate of getting to 14 or more PPR points per game is actually pretty similar to the high-end RB1 group at 73%, but they don't provide the same kind of ceiling. 37.5% of them got to 16 or more PPR points per game. That's a drop from one group to the next of over 20%. Now, I kept looking at these groups to see the difference from one group to the next. The high-end RB2s, for example, their rate of hitting 14 or more PPR points per game was 44.4%. Their rate of getting to 16 or more was 20.4%. The idea here is to see where big drop-offs occur, and to see if there are any groupings who get drafted later that compare well to groupings that get drafted earlier. Because similar to what I said earlier, what if the low-end RB2 group really doesn't have different outcomes than RB4s by ADP? Why would you consistently draft low-end RB2s, just generally speaking? Well, it's not that clean necessarily, but there are definitely some trends here. First off, RB1s just in general give you by far the best hit rates. I'm talking top 10, top 12 running backs. They're the ones providing the best ceilings at the position. Top 12 running backs as a group, so I'm not splitting them up by low-end ones and high-end ones. Top 12 running backs give you 16 or more PPR points per game at roughly a 47% clip. High-end RB2s are giving you that at a 20% rate. Low-end RB2s, a 15% one. It's just not even close. RB1s are really good in fantasy football. This data does show a very clear separation between RB1s and the rest of the position by ADP. And while there is some separation with RB2s, it's just not nearly as much, hence the running back dead zone. But I will say, you're still getting better outcomes when you draft RB2s compared to RB3s, compared to RB4s. Where there's really no difference between one group to the next is when you get into the low-end RB4 range. Low-end RB4s to high-end RB5s, all the way to like RB6s, there's really not that much difference in terms of outcome, like at all. That's because not a lot of those guys are emerging and becoming every week starters. But let me give you an example. Since 2014, we've had 34 RB2s give you 14 or more PPR points per game. 18 of them gave you 16 or more PPR points per game. When looking at RB3s, the number of guys giving you 14 or more PPR points per game falls from 34 in the RB2 range to 16 in the RB3 range. The RB4 area has 14. And then RB3s aren't giving you better rates of getting to 16 or more PPR points per game either. 18 of them did it in RB2 world. But that was just 4 and 7 when looking at RB3s and RB4s. Basically, if you didn't follow any of that, RB2s are providing better ceilings than RB3s and RB4s. But doesn't that sort of contradict the idea of the running back dead zone? Kind of, yes, but also kind of no. A lot of the success stories in the RB2 group are coming from high-end RB2s. For example, 44% of them are hitting 14 or more PPR points per game. That gets cut by more than half when you go into the low-end RB2 group. In other words, the dead zone has historically really started when you get into the RB18 to RB24 range. Those are the guys who have really burned fantasy teams. So where we're at is sort of the following. You've got these RB1s who do great in fantasy football. High-end RB1s smash, low-end RB1s, they're still pretty good. And then you get into the high-end RB2 group that does okay, though there is a drop-off. But they're almost in their own tier. Once you get into low-end RB2 range, those guys are not significantly better than high-end RB3s or even high-end RB4s. But there's also another dynamic to this that needs to be added. And it's a topic that I've spoken about before. It's on beating the running back dead zone. It's beating this area where the huge drop-off appears to occur in that mid RB2 range. I've spoken about this in the past, but when you have young running backs in the dead zone, those running backs actually perform really well. Now, I've been a big proponent of drafting rookies and second-year players in redraft leagues throughout your entire draft. And this data makes it even more apparent. You know those groupings that I talked about earlier? Let's take those exact same groups, but remove all players who aren't in their first or second year in the league. Let's focus only on year 1 and year 2 players. Obviously, that lowers our sample sizes. Rather than having 48 running backs in our high-end RB1 group, now we only have 11. We've had 11 first or second year running backs get drafted as top 6 backs in a given year since 2014. Most of the groups at the top, instead of consisting of like 50 players, now they have about 15 to 20 of them. There were 16 low-end RB1s within these parameters, 16 high-end RB2s, and so on. As we just learned, when looking at the entirety of the sample, RB1s are way better than RB2s. But high-end RB2s are a good bit better than lower-end RB2s. And then lower-end RB2s aren't that much better than most RB3s and some RB4s. When you focus solely on the first and second year players, that changes completely. It's kind of shocking. Get this, you guys. Since 2014, we've had 26 first and second year running backs find themselves in the RB2 group. So 26 first and second year backs played 8 or more games in the season, and they were drafted in the RB13 to RB24 range. 38% of them scored 14 or more PPR points per game. 31% of them scored 16 or more PPR points per game. Those RB2 rates of getting to 16 or more PPR points per game, they're not far off compared to what we see with all low-end RB1s. Meaning a rookie or a second-year player in the RB2 range, in the hypothetical running back dead zone, they're giving you a ceiling that's really not that far off from low-end RB1 territory. Now, the rates of getting to 14 or more PPR points per game, those rates are still a good bit lower. But if we're talking about ceiling, league-winning ceiling, young players in the dead zone can absolutely get you there. This is why I was in on Breece Hall as a rookie. Unfortunately, that was cut short. Or Jahmyr Gibbs last year. Because those young players, they're not really dead zone backs. Even if they're getting drafted in the running back dead zone. They hit at a much better rate than other RB2s. Like I said, 31% of these young RB2s scored 16 or more PPR points per game. When you look at older RB2s, guys past their second year in the league, that number is 13%. It goes from 31% to 13%. This plays into the story that I've always told about the running back dead zone. There are only so many bell cow running backs in the NFL, projectable bell cows. There aren't 24 of them. There are usually like 8 to 12 of them at most. When teams are drafting, they have to fill roster requirements. You usually have 12 teams in your league, and if each team is starting 2 running backs, then 24 running backs at least are being started. But we know there aren't 24 bell cow running backs. Once those bell cows are off the board, teams start to panic. They roster fill. They say to themselves, I've got to get a running back because a lot of them have flown off the board, and I have this requirement to start 2 of them. The demand for the position is so high because they're not a onesie position. So teams force the issue a little bit. They draft backs who might appear to be bell cows, but they're often fake bell cows. They're players who may not be as talented. That's why they're getting drafted in the RB2 range. But maybe there's a lack of competition in their backfields. Remember Mike Davis, Myles Gaskin? Those guys didn't really have a ton of talent, but they were in backfields that lacked alternatives entering the season until they didn't. The difference between those types of RB2s and rookies and second-year players is ambiguity. If a rookie is being drafted as an RB2, a top 24 running back, that actually should tell us that he's probably pretty talented. That without having stepped foot on a football field, he's still a top 24 running back in fantasy football. There's a lot of potential there. And the same could be said for a second-year player. We may not have a ton of information on that player. Maybe he split a backfield as a rookie, which is why he's not being drafted as an RB1. But that ambiguity is a good thing, not a bad thing. There's talent there, and that talent can lead to these monster league-winning seasons. We collectively need to reframe the way that we look at the running back dead zone. These dead zone backs, they aren't just any running back that gets drafted in some certain round or set of rounds. They're veteran running backs who get drafted in a certain spot within their position. A veteran running back who's getting selected as the RB18, the RB19, his outlook is not that much different than an RB3 or an RB4. Ignore opportunity cost. Ignore what you could draft instead of that RB18. I'm simply saying that within the position, that veteran mid-range RB2 by ADP, he's more than likely not going to give you that much higher of a ceiling than a player that you can get later. So from that perspective, it actually doesn't matter where these running backs are getting drafted. Whether you're playing on Underdog, where running backs go a lot later, or you're playing in your home league, where the RB2 is getting drafted in the middle of the 3rd round. Within the position, that veteran running back is still a bad bet. It's just an even worse bet when the opportunity cost is high. It's an even worse bet in your home league where you're passing up on some really, really good wide receivers. It's a little bit easier to take on when you're drafting on Underdog. But just because the opportunity cost equation shifts from one league to the next, it doesn't mean the running back dead zone idea is all of a sudden irrelevant. There's a running back dead zone in every single draft that you do. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I got a Becoming a Best Ball Bro episode dropping this week, as well as a Late Round Perspectives. Talk to you then.